The hero of Hulan is an urban legend from China. According to the legend, on March 28th of 1986, a man broke into a police dormitory in the Hulan district and conducted a brutal massacre. This man slaughtered 52 police officers and their family members while they slept. Before he left, he used his dagger to write an inscription on the wall. This inscription was something along the lines of Hulan Heroes or Hulan Knight. By September of that year, the Hulan Hero had murdered 200 police officers in total. Now, as I said in the beginning, this is an urban legend, not a factual account. However, like most urban legends, it does have a basis in truth. This is the story of the basis for the Hulan Hero urban legend. On June 6th of 1987, the Hulan police received a call about the murder of an entire family in Heilongjiang province. The officers dispatched to the scene already knew the homeowner, which made the drive there even more horrific than it already was. Once they arrived, they saw a scene of absolute nightmares. Bloodstains were scattered everywhere throughout the house, including the ceiling. 4 bodies lay on the floor. 36-year-old Zhang Fugui had been a police officer before he was stabbed 17 times in the chest, abdomen, and arms. His wife, Meng Fanjie, had been a teacher at the local school and also co-owned a restaurant with her husband. Her wounds were very similar to Zhang's. Their 10-year-old daughter had nearly been decapitated. Their 5-year-old son had perished from a singular stab wound. The couple's 7-year-old daughter, Zhang Yuzu, was the only survivor of the attack. She had sustained 3 stab wounds before fleeing the house and going to her neighbor, where the police were notified. Zhang was rushed to the hospital where she recovered from her physical injuries. The mental injuries were a different matter. Those scars would never heal. The house had been wildly ransacked with cabinets and drawers hanging open. Despite this, the family's money, clothing, and a camera they owned were all still in the house. The only thing the killer had stolen was Zhang's service weapon, along with his ammunition and holster. The investigators determined that the killer had also broken into the family's shed, where they found a single footprint from a number 42 farmland shoe. Autopsies were performed on all 4 victims, which revealed the time of deaths to range from 11 p.m. to 12 a.m. between June 5th and June 6th. After this, the investigators began to track the family's movements on the night of the massacre. Zhang's family had all stayed home that night, but Zhang himself had accompanied one of the leaders of a nearby township to a hospital because the leader had felt sick. After this, Zhang went out for a drink with a friend who was a construction worker. Then he went to his father-in-law's house to drink tea and finally returned home at around 9 p.m. Zhang only had a handful of close colleagues and everyone in his family had an alibi. Everyone described him as friendly and easy to get along with, not the kind of guy who you would expect to have enemies. According to everyone who knew him, nobody could possibly want to harm Zhang or his family. He had been a police officer for 2 years, which caused the investigation to become extremely intense. There was also another reason for the intensity of the investigation, however. The killer had stolen Zhang's handgun, which was a clear indication that he planned to kill again in the future. The first working theory regarding the massacre was that it had been motivated by revenge due to the brutality of the attack, but no viable suspects were immediately apparent. The police decided to look through Zhang's arrest records to find anyone who might have been holding a grudge against him. This led the police to a 27-year-old man named Li Sanhuai, who had been convicted of theft and forcefully subdued by Zhang. At the time of the investigation, Sanhuai was nowhere to be found, which raised even more suspicion against him. 3 months would pass before Sanhuai was finally found and arrested. The authorities interrogated him and his family, and Sanhuai admitted that he had fantasized about killing Zhang, but he denied ever actually doing it. The police did not listen. Even though they had not found the murder weapon, the authorities decided that Sanhuai was the most likely suspect. However, this would change on October 12th, when the killer struck again. Click the join button to become a member today. Channel members receive exclusive content as well as early access to all my content. He Ruishen was the chief of police in the town of Wanfa. His neighbors described him as overbearing and recounted instances when he had fired his service weapon to warn people to stay off his property. Therefore, it was nothing out of the ordinary when his neighbors heard gunshots that night. They figured the grumpy police chief was angry at someone who had crossed his property line, and they paid the noises no mind. He's wife and daughter became worried when he wasn't coming back in the house, so they stepped outside to check on him. He was lying in a pool of blood, weak but still alive. They asked him what had happened, and he managed to say, "Someone beat me with a gun," before passing out. As it turned out, He had not only been shot once, but had also been stabbed 4 times. 2 of the neighbors, Zhu Shushen and Shang Xiong, came outside to see what all the fuss was about, and they helped He's wife drag his unconscious body inside the house, then call the authorities. While Zhu was on the phone, the shooter emerged from behind a shed and opened fire, hitting Zhu and ending the call. Chang rushed the attacker in an attempt to incapacitate him. The masked man raised his gun and pulled the trigger, but the weapon jammed. This allowed Chang to pick up a blunt object and hit the man's wrist, which caused him to drop the gun. The attacker immediately fled the scene with a third neighbor hot on his heels after retrieving the gun, but the firearm suddenly discharged without the trigger being pulled. The neighbor realized they didn't know how to use a gun, so they stopped the chase and returned to help He and his family. The police arrived 20 minutes later with paramedics, who rushed He and Zhu to the hospital. Tragically, both men passed away before they arrived. Following the attacks, the police placed the whole town on lockdown, blocking all exits out of town. Officers patrolled the streets and searched various buildings, but no trace of the killer was found. The next morning, an investigation began. The police discovered footprints and a bullet in the yard, and He's neighbors provided them with the murder weapon. The authorities found several fingerprints on the firearm, some of which had come from the killer. The police were able to confirm that this gun had been the same one stolen from Zhang's house. They theorized that the gun had jammed at some point during the attack, which was why they had found stab wounds on He's body in addition to the gunshot wounds. He's neighbors provided a description of the killer, but it was so vague that it could not be used effectively. The man had been wearing a mask during the attack, and only his eyes had been visible. Despite this, they released the description to the public and officially ruled out Sanhui as a suspect. On October 13th, the day after the attack against He and his neighbors, the killer's clothing was found in a river alongside the holster he had stolen from Zhang. The shoes that had left the footprints at both houses were also found. Some of the clothing in the river was official police attire. Based on the little information they had, the police created a profile of the killer. He was between the ages of 25 and 35, wore a mixture of civilian and police clothes, was proficient with firearms, was not a smoker. He frequently came in close contact with substances such as diesel and engine oil, and he had lived in both Hulan and Baiyang County. With this profile in mind, the manhunt continued, but they weren't quick enough. On October 27th, Ma Fulin, the deputy director of the Hulan County Public Security Bureau and one of the chief investigators on the Hulan Hero case, was riding his bicycle home. Ma was described as optimistic and positive, but his colleagues were trying to convince him to retire due to his faltering health. His hearing was beginning to fail and he was growing weaker by the day. Nevertheless, Ma pushed through and continued to work because his wife had a mental illness which prevented her from taking care of herself. He arrived home that night, and nothing more would be known until the next day, when the police received a call from one of Ma's neighbors. Ma's daughter had run to the neighbor's house to tell them that there had been a murder. The police arrived, and to their dismay, the crime scene had already been heavily contaminated by geese, ducks, and curious onlookers. The crime scene itself was another nightmare. 3 bodies lay on a bed. Ma had sustained 3 wounds to the head and was covered in his own blood. His 20-year-old son-in-law, Ma Zhaochu, had several serious wounds across his body, a few of which were so deep that his bones were exposed. Ma's wife was leaning against the wall, her head missing. The police speculated that Ma had been killed in his sleep, which woke up his son-in-law and daughter, who did not have enough time to fight back before they were murdered too. This massacre resulted in 200 police officers launching a massive search effort throughout the surrounding area. After After examining the family's yard, the police determined that the killer had climbed over a wall and broken the lock on their door, which had already been weak to begin with. The wounds were consistent with either a hatchet or some type of axe. The killer had stolen Ma's service weapon and ammunition, ransacking the entire house in the process. The police also realized that the killer must have purposefully released the family's ducks and geese after the murders in order to contaminate the evidence. The killer very clearly knew what he was doing. During the course of the investigation, the police realized that 2 bicycles had been stolen shortly before the murders. They speculated that the killer had stolen one of these bikes and was using it to get around, so they launched a search effort for the bicycles. They located the bicycles near a boiler room 6 kilometers away from the crime scene. 2 unknown fingerprints were collected from the bikes, and the police went door to door comparing everyone's fingerprints to the ones on the bicycles. Fellow officers also had their prints compared. People were forced to give up information about their age, height, occupation, place of origin, and legal history during this operation in order to determine whether or not anyone matched the killer's profile. Due to this widespread fingerprinting operation, the public became aware of the killing spree. Fear soon took hold of the community, and police officers were especially fearful. The killer had proven his ruthlessness and the fact that he had no problem murdering children. No one was safe. Law enforcement soon enacted a curfew that started after sundown, so the only people who would be out after dark were armed police officers. Unfortunately, due to the nature of the murders, many law enforcement officers resigned out of fear, which caused a major roadblock in the investigation. Couple this with the fact that none of the fingerprints they had collected were a match, and the investigators were completely stumped. They tried to find a connection between the victims, but despite them having the same profession, they did not work directly with each other, and there was nothing linking them in any way. Zhu Hai was a 33-year-old police officer who was described as energetic. His higher-ups advised him not to wear his uniform due to the murders, but Zhu took enormous pride in his occupation and he wore the badge regardless. On December 27th, the Deputy Director of the Northwest Public Security Bureau of Hulan County, Dong Chao, invited Zhu to come to his home and give his report directly. Zhu arrived at the Chao residence at 5:20 p.m., unaware that Dong was not home. In order to approach the front door, Zhu had to walk past a dark alleyway with an attached courtyard. When he passed, a man who had been hiding against the wall in the alley emerged and fired a shot at Zhu's waist. Zhu screamed and tried to reach for his own weapon, but the shooter fired another shot into his abdomen. He screamed again and collapsed. The screaming caused Dong's 17-year-old son to run outside, where he saw Zhu lying unconscious in the snow. The killer was long gone, so the boy was able to run inside and call the police. Then he went back outside and hailed a passerby, who helped carry Zhu into the house. Paramedics bandaged Zhu's wounds and loaded him into a car, driving him as quickly as possible to the nearest hospital. The first hospital Zhu was brought to was severely under-equipped and had no qualified surgeons, so he was put in an ambulance and rushed to another hospital in the nearby city of Harbin. An emergency surgery was conducted in which the 2 bullets were removed from his body and given to the police, but Zhu tragically passed on the morning of December 28th. One of the bullets had struck his liver, causing him to bleed out. The bullets were a match for the gun that had been stolen from Ma Fulin. This murder had been the boldest thus far. A police officer had been killed right in front of the deputy director's house. Hulan County was placed under martial law and all traffic intersections and railway lines were blocked. Riot police and local cops patrolled the streets and set up checkpoints. Law enforcement conducted surprise searches of homes and interrogated countless people. Sniffer dogs were brought in to track the killer, but they always ended up losing the scent very quickly. Despite the county being under full-blown martial law, the culprit could still not be identified or caught. The police believed that Dong had been the intended target of Zhu's murder, but the only piece of evidence at the crime scene was the killer's footprints in the snow. Numerous armed police officers were stationed at the house to prevent any further attacks. It's also important to note that Dong Chao was one of the lead investigators on the Hulan Hero case. As the police reviewed the profile of the killer, they realized there was a problem. The killer was very clearly experienced with firearms, so they needed to raise their age range in order to compensate for this level of experience. They estimated that he was between 35 and 50 years old. Following this update, the police once again launched a massive operation of interrogating local residents, to no avail. The Hulan Hero was truly a ghost, someone who could come and go as he pleased and never get caught. "30-year-old Liu Yongji was the bailiff for the Hulan County People's Court. He was married and had a 7-year-old daughter whom he would often play with. In the winter, he would take his little girl out on a nearby river when it was frozen. He was a happy and successful man who nobody in their right mind would ever target. Unfortunately, the Hulan Hero was clearly not in his right mind. On February 15th of 1988, Liu was doing laundry while his daughter was watching TV. When Liu was done with the laundry, he went outside to dump out the dirty water, but he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. He turned around and saw a man dressed all in black stabbing him. Liu was a former soldier and he fought back with everything he had, but the attacker was strong and had the element of surprise on his side. He managed to stab Liu again, but this was when the bailiff remembered he still had his service weapon in a holster on his pants. He drew the weapon and the attacker drew his own pistol. Both men fired at each other, with one bullet hitting Liu in a non-vital area. All the other shots missed. After the attack, Liu's wife had to run 10 minutes away to the nearest payphone in order to call the police. The authorities arrived with sniffer dogs, which walked halfway across the frozen river before losing the scent. Liu was somehow still conscious at the time, and the police brought him to the hospital. He underwent surgery, but soon perished from his wounds. 2 bullet casings at the crime scene matched Ma Fulin's service weapon. Law enforcement performed door-to-door interrogations, but yet again, nothing was found. Liu's murder was the first time the Hulan Hero had targeted a civilian. This expanded the list of potential victims to include anyone even remotely connected to the justice system. The only other incident connected to the Hulan Hero was a home invasion of a correctional officer, but the intruder fled the scene without causing any harm. The case was finally shelved in 1989 due to an utter lack of leads, tips, or evidence. After enough time had passed, martial law was lifted and life went back to normal in Hulan, but the killer was never identified. In the end, investigators concluded that the Hulan Hero had been a careful planner with a deeply rooted hatred for authority. He had clearly been familiar with the areas in which he operated, which helped him evade law enforcement. He was highly skilled and carried out each murder with brutal efficiency. Worst of all, he never showed any remorse, and he had no problems with targeting kind-hearted people as well as their children. Some people believe the killer had been a prison inmate who began their murder spree after getting released, but others believe he was a law enforcement officer himself. After all, he had plenty of experience with firearms and he never left any evidence behind. He even knew exactly how to contaminate the crime scenes. The final murder in the spree was especially high profile. Liu's home was located in a community that was almost exclusively reserved for law enforcement officers and court officials. To this day, the Hulan Hero's identity remains unknown. He got away with numerous barbaric murders, and he could very well be alive today. Let's hope that his appetite for murder has faded away.